It's striking how subtle and often unseen some manipulative behaviors can be, specifically those used by women that can negatively affect men. These behaviors rarely appear as outright aggression. Instead, they often take the form of what seems like affection, vulnerability, or even intuition. This disguise is the initial trick. It's not the manipulation itself that's deceptive, but the way it's presented. We tend to think of power as something loud and obvious, almost like a performance. We imagine those who dominate as being crude or forceful. In close relationships, though, power works in a much quieter way. It whispers, smiles, and knows exactly when to cry. The man experiencing this doesn't feel controlled. He sees it as love, emotional complexity, or simply how women are. I was surprised to realize how early this kind of shaping begins. In 2013, psychologist Eli Finkel talked about the suffocation model of modern relationships. We now expect our partners to give us not only stability, but also a sense of who we are and what our lives mean. Love has become a key place where we look for psychological support. While this may seem like progress, it can also create dependence. If your sense of yourself depends on one person's approval, you're already in a situation where they have a lot of power over you. This usually starts not with anger, but with a feeling of connection. A man meets a woman who seems to truly understand him. She shares his sense of humor, his goals, and his hurts. In 1992, researchers studying what they later called the chameleon effect showed how subtly copying someone else can make them like and trust you more. We often call this chemistry, but it's not really magic. It's a tactic, often done without thinking, but sometimes planned. When someone matches your pace, the way you talk, and your fears, you naturally let your guard down. You feel like you've been chosen, and once you feel chosen, you start to invest in the relationship. I've seen this same pattern at work too. In leadership training based on ideas made known by Niccolò Machiavelli, influence isn't about using force, but about carefully shaping how people see things. The leader doesn't need to be feared all the time, but must be seen as necessary. In relationships, this need is built by making someone feel emotionally unique. The message is, no one understands you like I do. It sounds nice, but it also slowly cuts you off from the rest of the world. Here's where psychology starts to become unsure. It prefers to describe these situations as different attachment styles: anxious, avoidant, secure. These are clear categories, but when you listen to men talk about their relationships, you hear something that sounds more planned. A woman might share a sad story about her past on the third date, complete with tears and specific details about a father who left or a betrayal. The man feels like he needs to protect her and steps up to commit sooner than he had intended. Is she lying? Not necessarily. The vulnerability could be real, but the timing is powerful. Sharing personal information is a kind of currency. Research from the early 2000s showed that carefully timed self-disclosure can make people trust and work with you faster. In love, showing vulnerability early can speed up how quickly someone becomes attached. He feels responsible before he's had a chance to really see if they're compatible, and once he feels responsible, he starts to lose his freedom. This is something we don't often say out loud. Manipulation isn't always meant to be harmful. Often, it's a way of adapting. Women who haven't always had clear power in society have become good at indirect methods, carefully reading emotions, using social skills, and noticing small signals. Anthropologists have found that in some cultures, women gain status through alliances rather than physical strength. In today's dating world, we still see echoes of these behaviors: influencing without being confrontational, guiding without ordering. But the man in this situation doesn't see a plan. He just feels a shift in mood. She might pull away a little, not in a big way, just enough for him to notice the distance. He then tries harder, texting more, making more plans. I've heard men say they just didn't want to lose her, even though nothing was ever said directly. The control works because it's hard to prove. Studies in 2014 showed that rewards that come at unexpected times create stronger attachments than those that are consistent. Casinos use this, and so do social media sites. A partner who switches between being warm and distant can create the same effect. The excitement comes not from stability, but from the hope of getting close again. He's not addicted to her, but to the possibility of winning back her affection. Officially, this is called emotional complexity, trauma, or hormones. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's simply a way to gain control. And here's where our understanding starts to get shaky, because we don't like to think that love can involve strategy. We prefer to believe that love is a safe place away from politics. But every relationship involves a balance of power. Who starts conversations? Who decides on commitment? Who sets the emotional tone? The person who can pull away without falling apart has the upper hand. I once talked to a mid-level manager in his late 30s who was capable and logical. He could negotiate big contracts without any problem. But in his relationship, he felt like he was always trying to figure out what she was feeling. He used spreadsheets for work, but with her, he was just guessing. When I asked him what would happen if he stopped trying to understand her, he paused and said, "She'd think I don't care." That was his fear, not fighting, not losing status, but being seen as morally wrong. That's the key change. But the battle isn't physical, it's about ethics. You're not threatened with punishment, but with being seen as cold, insensitive, or not manly enough. And so the game goes on without anyone ever calling it a game. I'm not suggesting that there's a secret plan. These things usually happen without people even realizing it. But just because it's unconscious doesn't mean it's harmless. Strategy doesn't need evil intentions, it just needs a reason. In today's relationships, emotional security, money, and social status can be strong motivators. The dangerous part isn't that influence exists. There's always influence. The danger is when one person understands how the relationship works emotionally and the other thinks they're just following their heart. The outcome is easy to guess. He calls it love. She sees it as stability. But underneath, a structure is forming where support goes one way and reassurance goes the other. Investments aren't equal, and it becomes harder to leave. And the most unsettling thing is that, from the inside, it feels natural and like it was meant to be. The question isn't whether these behaviors are evil, but whether the man even knows he's in a situation where affection, vulnerability, and intuition aren't just feelings, but tools. If he can't see the situation clearly, he can't tell if he's a partner or just being used. And the starting point isn't sex, jealousy, or even fighting, but support. Not loud praise or flattery, but something more subtle, the feeling of being needed. In 1985, psychologists Roy Baumeister and Mark Leary started working on what became known as the need to belong theory. They concluded in 1995 that the desire for stable, positive relationships is a basic human need, not just a luxury or a cultural preference. It's a drive. When that drive is activated, we focus on keeping that connection. It's a drive. Psychology says this is about mutual bonding, but that's where the theory starts to fail, because the need to belong affects men and women differently. Many men are raised to believe their worth comes from being useful, achieving things, protecting, and providing. Without that usefulness, their sense of self is shaken. I was surprised to find out how measurable this is. In 2009, researchers studying contingent self-esteem found that people whose self-worth depends on external approval are more anxious, more compliant, and more likely to put up with unfair treatment. They don't resist influence openly. They argue with themselves first. Now, imagine that happening in a romantic relationship. A woman says, "I only feel safe with you," or "You're the only one who understands me." It sounds intimate and like something he's earned. The man feels important, and his brain registers that this is significant. This isn't just an idea. Studies show that social approval activates the same reward centers in the brain as money. Recognition is a biochemical reaction. Here's the turning point. If that recognition becomes irregular, it becomes even more valuable. In psychology, Irregular rewards lead to stronger habits than consistent ones. Casinos use this, and so do apps like Facebook, where unpredictable notifications keep people engaged. You don't know when the reward will come, so you keep paying attention. Now, imagine that emotional warmth works the same way. A man who was initially praised now starts looking for signals. Was her smile real? Why did it take her 3 hours to reply? Why did she mention that other guy's name twice? His attention narrows, his work suffers, and he can't sleep. He's not weak, but he's off balance. I didn't realize how measurable this imbalance can be. Studies show that conflict raises stress hormones not only during fights, but also during times of uncertainty. Uncertainty is hard on the body, which prepares for a threat without knowing what it is. Uncertainty is hard on. That's where the second thing comes in, switching between closeness and distance. First, she idealizes him, then she's cold, then there's a reconciliation. The reconciliation is key. Without it, the system falls apart. But when the warmth returns, even briefly, it feels amazing. He feels relieved and grateful, seeing the return as proof of their deep bond. In therapy, this pattern sometimes looks like what's seen in borderline personality disorder. But outside of these extremes, milder forms go unnoticed. A marketing manager I talked to described his relationship as intense but passionate. His partner would accuse him of not caring, pull away physically, and then start dramatic reconciliations. He started changing his actions to prevent potential problems. He stopped meeting female colleagues alone and limited his after-work events, not because she demanded it, but because her mood would change after those events. There was no clear rule, just an implied consequence. Here, logic fails. He thinks he's making his own choices, but he's really adjusting to avoid emotional turmoil. The third thing is hidden in jealousy. In 1991, psychologist David Buss shared research showing how much comparisons of status and sexual competition affect men. Jealousy doesn't need infidelity, it just needs a hint. A casual comment like, "He's so confident," a story about an ex who used to surprise me more, or a picture with another man posted without any explanation. Each thing alone isn't much, but together, they create competition. Competition focuses attention and shakes confidence. I once spoke to a software engineer who felt physically sick after seeing his partner talking warmly with another man at a party. When I asked what happened, he couldn't say exactly. Nothing inappropriate, he admitted, just, I don't know. A vibe. That's the point. Uncertainty leads to speculation, and speculation increases insecurity. Uncertainty leads to... People often say, jealousy is a sign of male weakness, and sometimes that's true. But in situations where subtle comparisons are used on purpose or without thinking, jealousy becomes a way to control someone. If he thinks he can be replaced, he tries harder, invests more, and puts up with more. This is Machiavellian without being openly aggressive. Niccolò Machiavelli advised leaders to avoid being hated while still keeping control. Emotional changes do this well. She's not a tyrant, she's complex. He doesn't hate her, he studies her. And that's the change from partnership to surveillance. He watches her tone, her face, how quickly she responds. His focus shifts outward. Instead of judging the relationship by steady standards, he judges it by daily changes, and his mental stability weakens. Here, just saying it's communication issues isn't enough. Communication needs clarity, but these situations thrive on uncertainty. I'm not saying all emotional inconsistency is planned. People are complicated, hormones change, and stress happens. But the effect is the same whether it's on purpose or not. If unpredictability consistently leads to men trying harder, being less independent, and investing more, then it's a form of control, whether it was intended or not. The man tells himself he's fighting for love, but he's really trying to calm a storm he can't control. And the most confusing thing is that when things finally calm down, he feels thankful, not powerful. So, we have to ask, if someone controls the emotional weather in a relationship, who really has the power? The one who argues logically, or the one who decides when things get better? If she controls the emotional environment, she influences his whole body. And the next thing she does is even more clever. It doesn't just destabilize him, it changes his sense of right and wrong. Once he starts questioning his reactions to these emotional changes, the next step is to question everything he thinks. These emotional changes. The term gaslighting became known long after the 1944 film Gaslight. In that story, a husband changes small things in the house and denies that they happened, making his wife think she's going crazy. Today, the word is overused, but it really means denying another person's view of reality to gain power over them. I'm interested not in the extreme cases, but in the small moral changes that happen in regular conflicts. He says, "When you disappear for 2 days without telling me, it makes me anxious." She replies, "You're too sensitive. I can't breathe around you." Notice the change. His concern disappears, and the focus becomes his personality. In 2011, psychologists showed how quickly people blame others' character while excusing their own actions as just being due to the situation. In relationships, this becomes a weapon. Her pulling away is seen as stress, while his reaction is seen as insecurity. Here, attachment theory is often brought up. You have anxious attachment. It sounds clinical, but these labels can be used to control the conversation. Once a label is used, the discussion changes from behavior to identity. He's no longer reacting to something specific, but defending his whole psychological makeup. I once watched a meeting where a startup founder complained that his partner was flirting with investors at events. She responded calmly, "Your jealousy comes from wanting to control me." The room's mood changed immediately. He was no longer a man expressing discomfort. He was a symbol of oppression. He froze, not because he had no argument, but because he suddenly seemed morally wrong. That's how moral inversion becomes a strategy. The person who's worried is seen as the problem, and the person who caused the problem becomes the victim. Research shows that people who frame arguments in moral terms gain power and are less likely to be challenged directly. When something becomes about morals instead of practical concerns, disagreeing feels mean. It's about morals. In relationships, this can be devastating. If you loved me, you would trust me. Only insecure men need constant reassurance. Real men are emotionally strong. These aren't just random phrases, they're triggers that target someone's identity. The man now has a hard choice. Either he stands his ground and risks being seen as insecure, controlling, and immature, or he drops his complaint to stay morally in the right. Similar things happen in public scandals. In high-profile relationship disputes that the media covers, stories often quickly change from specific events to judgments about character. One person becomes toxic, and the other becomes brave. Nuance disappears. Once the moral framing is set, evidence doesn't matter as much. Here's where the ideas of Niccolò Machiavelli become disturbingly relevant. He said that leaders should act strategically while maintaining an image of virtue. By appearing morally superior, rulers can quell opposition. Similarly, in personal interactions, appearing morally upright can be more effective than aggression in silencing criticism. It's not right to say that every appeal to morality is a form of manipulation. Sometimes accusations are justified, and some people are inherently controlling. Yet, this system relies on creating doubt, not necessarily on truth. I talked to a financial expert who recounted having months of unproductive arguments. She would accuse him of paranoia when he noticed holes in her stories. She would call him insecure and accuse him of projecting his own potential cheating when he wanted to talk about boundaries with her male friends. He started recording their talks to make sure his memory was accurate, not to use the recordings against her. This struck me as odd. When someone starts to document reality to make sure they aren't being irrational, something has fundamentally changed. Leon Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance back in the 1950s showed that people resolve internal conflicts by changing their beliefs instead of addressing relationship problems. If a relationship is valued, the mind will twist events to protect it. The analyst might think, maybe I am overreacting, or maybe I'm too strict. Each compromise keeps the relationship steady, but damages self-trust. It is hard to get self-trust back. There's also a social effect. Friends might support the woman's point of view in a group, saying things like, "You're lucky she's so independent," or "Don't be so possessive." The moral judgment becomes shared, and her partner's personal discomfort is seen as questionable by the group. The irony is clear. The man who tries to set limits is viewed as the one causing trouble, while the person creating uncertainty seems emotionally mature. This is the fourth method, changing reality using a moral high ground. It's not about lying, but about changing the standards of judgment. The focus of the discussion shifts from, "Did this action hurt me?" to, "What kind of person are you for feeling hurt?" Once this shift occurs, logical discussion falls apart. It's hard to argue against an assessment of your character without coming across as defensive, which then confirms guilt. I was surprised that many skilled, analytical people gave up their own perceptions when faced with sustained moral pressure. These people are engineers, lawyers, and executives who negotiate million-dollar contracts, but hesitate to say, "This doesn't feel right," at home. It's no longer about losing an argument. Now, it involves losing their moral standing. Once a man no longer trusts his interpretation of events and changes his memory before speaking, the situation changes again. Control now depends on the story being told, not on volatility. This raises a significant issue. If reality can be twisted to support claims of his flaws, what foundation does he have left? The idea that reality itself can be reframed as showing his flaws makes it morally dangerous to resist. Then, another method quietly slips in: vulnerability. It is not a collapse or hysteria, but something more subtle: visible fragility. In 2011, Brené Brown, a social psychologist, made vulnerability a popular idea, presenting it as courage. It was promoted in corporate seminars and leadership meetings. The idea was that openness builds trust, and that's true. This is where theory meets strategy. Openness also provides advantage. Studies in behavioral economics on the identifiable victim effect have found that people are more willing to give resources to a specific person experiencing an emotional event rather than towards an abstract cause. A single crying child raises more funds than statistics about thousands of people. Focusing on personal vulnerability narrows the scope of moral concern. If you apply that to a relationship, imagine a woman saying, "I don't know why I always end up feeling abandoned," with a slight break in her voice. It's not an accusation, it's a confession, but it strongly suggests that if he withdraws or sets a boundary, he might become another reason for abandonment. He is no longer negotiating what he prefers, but dealing with her past trauma. A tech entrepreneur told me about how his partner would freeze during disagreements and whisper, "I cannot handle conflict." It reminds me of my childhood. He stopped bringing up issues, not because they were resolved, but because he didn't want to cause visible pain. Over time, decisions leaned toward what made her comfortable, including travel, social events, and even financial risks. Power changed, but it seemed like care. Here, Stephen Cartman's drama triangle appears again, but in a more subtle form. The victim role is the center of attention, but when someone appears fragile, others move into roles of rescuers. Rescuers feel like they are doing good. That is the catch. In 1978, psychologist Ellen Langer did experiments on perceived helplessness. Observers were more likely to step in when people seemed to have little control, even when it wasn't required. The perceived inability triggered automatic caretaking. Imagine that inability being selective. A woman might be decisive at work, assertive with friends, and strategic in social situations, but gets overwhelmed when her preferences are challenged in the relationship. She may say, "I'm just not strong like you," or "You're better at making decisions." The man takes on the responsibility, framing it as leadership. I noticed that capable women often divide strength this way. They are competent in public but fragile in private. This isn't always conscious but is still effective. The media reinforces this idea. In movies, such as Gone Girl, vulnerability is used as a weapon, but it is more subtle in daily life, such as crying at crucial moments or shutting down emotionally when boundaries are discussed, accompanied by claims of being misunderstood, overworked, or emotionally tired. Compassion is a powerful numbing agent that reduces critical thinking. Research in 2015 on empathy-induced altruism showed that empathic concern makes people more likely to agree, even when it goes against their interests. When someone seems distressed, the brain focuses on easing that distress over abstract fairness. The man then adjusts by making compromises, framing them as acts of kindness, such as driving farther, paying more, or canceling plans. He tells himself that he is being supportive. Gradually, imbalance sets in. The socially acceptable reason is emotional safety. She feels safe enough to be vulnerable with you. This could be true, but safety is not the same as dependency, and vulnerability is not the same as incapacity. It is hard to see the line between real weakness and intentional helplessness, and that uncertainty creates power. One of my clients told me that he put up with financial inequality in his relationship for years. He said, "She's had such a hard life. I didn't want to pressure her. When I said that she handles complex projects at work without problems, he paused and said, 'That's different,' but he couldn't say why. The difference was in the setting. Competence at work made her look better, but vulnerability in the relationship secured protection." Machiavelli had a good understanding of human behavior. In The Prince, he noted that people are swayed more by appearances and immediate emotions than by facts. A leader who appears humble and devout gains more trust than one who shows raw strength. Selective weakness prevents scrutiny. When it comes to personal relationships, visible fragility can hide strategic control. If she is emotionally wounded, criticism feels cruel. If she is struggling, negotiation seems selfish. If she is overwhelmed, his boundaries feel aggressive. This approach rarely involves conscious intent, which makes it so effective. She might genuinely feel fragile at times, and he might genuinely want to protect her. However, the longer-term effect is that decisions are made based on her emotional responses. The state of the relationship then bends to accommodate what the most visibly vulnerable person needs. Here's the strange thing. The person who seems weaker can quietly become the one in charge. The man starts to think about her stress levels before he brings up changes, adjusts his tone, and postpones difficult talks, not because he lacks valid points, but to avoid triggering visible pain. The result is subtle. He feels strong, and she seems delicate, but everything moves in one direction. Where is the line between compassion and compliance? When does protecting someone turn into giving up one's agency? If power can be hidden in tears, then the absence of aggression doesn't mean the absence of control. Power can also hide inside desire, making the situation less psychological and more economic. Intimacy is not just about feelings. It involves access. Limited access then creates a hierarchy. In evolutionary psychology, David Buss suggested that sexual access and resource commitment have served as forms of currency between men and women. Though the language is awkward to use, the data is consistent across cultures. However, modern relationships claim that sex should be spontaneous, free, and not connected to negotiation. That's what most people say. Yet, things feel different in reality. Data from the General Social Survey in 2018 showed that young men reported being sexually inactive more in comparison to previous generations. People then discussed ideas around pornography, economic issues, and digital distractions. Yet, one point is missed a lot. When access becomes scarce, it gains in value. Scarcity changes behavior. Scarcity is one of the oldest principles of influence. Robert Cialdini showed in experiments that limited availability increases perceived desirability, even if the product is the same. Participants rated the quality of cookies higher when there were few in the jar. The mind confuses rarity with worth. You can now apply that to intimacy. Sexual energy flows a lot at the beginning of a relationship. Novelty raises desire. He feels special. Over time, access becomes conditional and based on mood, compliance, and emotional agreement. It may not be something that is easily seen. Statements like, "I just don't feel connected recently," or "It's hard to be intimate when I'm stressed," may be honest feelings, but the long-term impact is structural. If sexual closeness happens when both partners agree and is withheld when there is conflict, then the nervous system learns the pattern. Agreement equals reward, but disagreement means being deprived. I once spoke to a married investment banker who strategically planned arguments by waiting until after a good weekend. He knew that raising difficult topics could stop intimacy for weeks. He wasn't doing it consciously, but he was getting used to the pattern. His timing wasn't based on principle, but on the chance of getting intimate. This is framed as emotional connection. Women need connection to feel desire. Some research supports this, and here is where explanation becomes weak. Connection comes to be defined by her internal state. If she gets to decide when there is enough connection, she decides when intimacy happens. Who controls access controls the hierarchy. The second layer is status comparison. In 1991, Buss's research showed that men are sensitive to signs of sexual rivalry and status issues. This isn't about beliefs, it is something that can be measured. Men reported feeling more distress in situations that involved a threat to sexual exclusivity versus emotional ones. You can see that in modern life. Social media amplifies what is visible. Photos with attractive colleagues, stories about confident exes, or a casual comment such as, "He just has this presence," are not betrayals, but signals. I was surprised by how comparison can change male behavior. A startup founder increased his working hours because his partner praised another man's ambition during a dinner party. She wasn't directly criticizing him, but he interpreted the comparison as him lacking something. Status signaling is clear in corporate environments with titles, salaries, and office sizes. However, status signaling in relationships is more based on emotion. Who is more desired? Who has options? Dating applications have intensified this. Platforms, such as Tinder, turned romantic attention into numbers, like the number of matches, likes, and messages, and the knowledge of other possible partners lingers, even in monogamous relationships. Scarcity plus comparison forms a closed loop. Compliance grows if he thinks her choices are great and his access is conditional. This isn't about rude exchanges, it is about atmosphere. The pattern sets in if warmth and intimacy are plenty when he does well and scarce when he resists. If admiration is directed outward with a purpose, his competitive instincts are triggered. Divorce rates add another layer. About half of marriages end in many Western countries, and women start a reasonable number of filings. Analysts point to economic independence, social changes, and changing desires. All of this is true. Yet, the understanding that leaving is a working choice changes bargaining power. The other adjusts if one partner feels like they have more choices. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler needs to understand fortuna and virtue, meaning circumstance and capability. Circumstance involves current market conditions, social connections, economic power, and perceived desirability. A woman who shows that her options are strong increases her negotiating position without making threats. I am not saying that this is a plan. Many signals are generally cultural and are reinforced by peers. The media celebrates female desirability and choice as empowerment, which is not necessarily wrong. However, empowerment shifts the balance. The man feels this as tension, not as a theory. He wonders whether a lowered sexual drive means stress or dissatisfaction. He questions whether admiration toward other men is innocent or comparative. He works harder, dresses better, and earns more. This can be positive, but it is sometimes encouraged by fear. Fear has its costs. Intimacy stabilizes identity when it is unconditional. However, it comes to act as a type of money when conditional. Currency can be saved, held back, invested, or redirected. The silent economy then operates beneath romance. Access changes, comparison circles, scarcity increases desire, and status changes effort. This is unsettling. If desire can be limited and status can be signaled, then love is no longer just a feeling, it is a market. This leads to an uncomfortable question: who sets the price in a market, and who is paying more than they know? We are not only speaking about feelings once love becomes a market. We are speaking about power. Power is shown through authority. This is where relationships get tough. It appears as though validation, volatility, moral inversion, strategic vulnerability, scarcity of intimacy, and status comparison are separate behaviors. They feel personal, emotional, and accidental. Yet, when it all comes together, the architecture ends up being clear. Niccolò Machiavelli did not write about dating or feelings between people. He wrote about states, rulers, and existing in tough political systems. And the idea that a ruler should avoid open hatred while ensuring dependency comes up repeatedly. Control of perception, fear of loss, and management of resources are all that is needed. Relationships rarely have explicit domination, yet dependency can be grown invisibly by using validation that causes addiction, volatility that affects independence, moral framing that silences disagreement, vulnerability that changes decision-making, and scarcity that increases value. None of them may require shouting or open orders. In 2002, social psychologists John French and Bertram Raven named different sources of power: coercive, reward, legitimate, referent, and expert. Coercive power is crude in relationships, but reward and referent power are more efficient. You don't need threats if you control identity and reward through things like affection, approval, and sexual access. One senior executive I spoke with runs a global division. He understood power in negotiations, and he made sure to know what others valued and managed his access to those things. Even though he handled negotiation with leverage instinctively, he described feeling permanently off balance in his marriage. He said that she just had stronger emotions. When I mapped his experience to the sources of power, the pattern was obvious. She controlled emotional rewards, framed moral stories, and hinted at other options. He controlled income, but income did not control daily intimacy. He had official dominance, but she had emotional leverage. That is when the romantic ideal ends. We are taught that love is a union of equals, a safe space where there is no competition, a story that data disputes. Studies repeatedly show that stability is more certain when mutual influence and perceived fairness exist rather than just passion. Resentment quietly grows when influence is not equal, even if the relationship looks caring to outsiders. Machiavelli warned that rulers need to understand human nature as it is and know that people respond more to the fear of loss than to gratitude. Modern behavioral economics validates this theory with loss aversion research spearheaded by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, who found that the pain of losing something feels stronger than the joy of getting something similar. In relationships, what hurts more than the loss of love, or even worse, the loss of importance within love? If a man fears losing intimacy, approval, or exclusivity, he becomes agreeable. This isn't because he is weak, but because his nervous system wants connection with people. The one who can withdraw without collapsing holds a better position. This is not about evil, but about design. I hesitate here because framing relationships using power seems cynical and cold, but ignoring it does not make it disappear. It leaves one person unknowledgeable. Alliances were made official in historical courts through marriage. Emotion may have existed, but power was explicitly calculated. People act as though status, access, and power are separate from love today. However, displays on social media, public demonstrations of love, and subtle competitive comparison persist. I am not saying that women study strategy before they enter relationships. The patterns are often adaptive, culturally strengthened, and unconscious. But unconscious strategy still shapes outcomes. What underlines all of these is the idea that control works when it feels like a choice. Someone who chooses to comply, invest, or adjust does not feel mistreated, but devoted. Asymmetrical devotion is power. Machiavelli wrote that a ruler doesn't need to have all virtues, but needs to seem virtuous. With personal matters, it's enough to manage perceptions of scarcity, moral high ground, emotional fragility, and options. This may cause power without violence. The strange thing here? A lot of what I'm describing can exist with actual emotion. Control can exist together with emotion, and we have been given a manual of how to act in love. The man senses that something is not right, but cannot name it. Over time, he feels small, more cautious, and eager to please, not enough to rebel, but enough to change how he behaves. The real problem is not whether strategy exists in love, which it does. The real problem is if both partners know the subtle workings of authority beneath their love. Machiavelli did not write to promote cruelty, but described how reality works in unstable systems. If relationships are systems where attachment, status, and scarcity meet, then his rules apply because people are strategic overall. That leaves us with an uncomfortable observation. In the silent politics of love, those who are less afraid of loss often have more control. The central problem may not be affection, but about fear. Have more control. If the problem is fear, the ultimate question must be asked: why does he stay? He isn't dumb or ignorant, and neither is the woman a villain reading some trick book, and the end might be colder and more uneasy. He stays because he helped create the system, and leaving threatens something deeper than discomfort. In 1969, John Bowlby expanded attachment theory beyond just children and proposed that relationships trigger the same warning systems as early separation. Later studies found that leaving activates areas of the brain linked with physical pain. When a man feels instability, his nervous system does not see it as strategy, but views it as a danger to survival. I once talked with a corporate lawyer who took apart hostile witnesses, yet felt small when his partner acted warmly or withdrawn. Small struck me as odd. It is not rational. It is the language of a child that fears being abandoned. Here is where the tension between victim and partner starts. It seems obvious that someone wouldn't put up with volatility, accept moral inversion, or chase conditional intimacy, but each compromise feels temporary inside the system. People hope to solve things later by waiting for things to slow down, or after they prove their commitment. Leon Festinger's work on cognitive dissonance is part of the reason. We increase the perceived value of our investments to justify the investment spent. I was not aware of how great the sunk cost bias can be in relationships. People keep investing in failing projects simply because they invested resources. When money turns into moments in life, it multiplies the cost. Then there is culture. A lot of boys are raised to associate strength with masculinity, so they are told not to complain or act needy, but to solve their problems and care for the woman. That collides with relationship complexity as an adult. They see the hurt as weakness rather than data. So, they adjust, but not the same way. Weakness rather than. Surveys on mental health show that men are less likely to seek help, even when they have distress in their relationships. The stigma around fragility works selectively, as they might see the woman's fragility as special, but their own as shameful. There is the illusion of control. Psychologist Ellen Langer showed that people overestimate how much they can affect unstable situations. In relationships, this looks like taking on too much responsibility. Structural instability cannot be fixed by trying harder. I have seen men who understand transaction theory, yet won't use that reasoning at home because love should be pure, and acknowledging strategy is a betrayal. But theory ends again. We are told to build healthy relationships on equality, but research shows differences in drive, income, social capital, and emotional effort. Equality is ideal, but power differences exist. Men are trained to pursue, provide, and endure, but women have historically navigated situations where direct power was limited, with indirect influence becoming skill. When behaviors cross, feedback loops form. She controls access, he increases investment, she senses increased leverage, and he feels increasingly greater risk of loss. Each is doing their part without necessarily naming it. Is he a victim? Yes. Emotional manipulation can destabilize even a competent adult, but he refuses to examine how incentives are shaping his behavior. The strangest were men who felt embarrassed about themselves and not anger toward their partners when describing these. One said that they knew that something was off but didn't want to see it. They didn't do that because they feared her, but because they feared being alone. Studies on loneliness show that it links with great mortality risk, and the body treats isolation as danger. Leaving a destabilizing relationship can feel more dangerous than putting up with it. He stays because inside may feel sad but is better than the external sadness. That is why this look at it cannot end with blaming. Systems are complex, biology sets up attachment, culture marks masculinity, personal pain changes tolerance, and bargaining power changes with money. In the end, the one thing that exists is what Niccolò Machiavelli understood: fear of loss. In political systems, the ruler who fears rebellion governs carefully, and the subject is compliant for fearing exile. The partner adjusts out of fear of abandonment. The man doesn't fall because another controls him. He falls because he doesn't know what he can do. That leads to a conclusion that is mechanical and not moral. Power in relationships belongs to the one who is less afraid to leave. The rest is negotiation.